How's it going? Here I am. Again, I thought to present another episode. Just wanted to jump on here really quickly before I do some work. But I've been thinking about a verse a lot, and I think it's important given the current circumstances and times that we live in. But it is the verse that says, "They will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the power of their testimony," which is Revelation 12:11. So I want to share my testimony. Hopefully I can do this in about 15 minutes. And then certainly within that, we'll have 5 minutes of the gospel for the lost and the lost religious false convert. But yeah, Revelation 12:11. "They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death." And I just think, like, right now, man, gosh, isn't this the time? I mean, Revelation's about the end times. What a powerful message. The key is, if you're going to survive in these times, if you're going to make it, you need to have a testimony. And what is your testimony? Well, simply stated, your testimony is when you point to that time that you were born again. Like, there has to be that moment in time where you went from death to life. If you don't have that, you're not born again. Like, born again's not like a figurative kind of thing, like a statement, some metaphorical, symbolic suggestion. It's a literal, like, moment in time where you were born of the Spirit, reborn by the Spirit of God. If you can't point to that, I'm going to challenge you that you don't have the thing that is evidence that necessitates, that you've been born again, it substantiates that something's actually taken place in your heart. You have to go from that dark to light, from death to life, from being dead in your sins to being alive in Christ and dead to sin. For me, it happened in a specific place. I could literally go and drop a pin on Google Maps and tell you what the coordinates are, where I was born again. And it was on March 20th. It was sometime in the afternoon, after 3 o'clock, maybe around 4:30, 2005. So, I know where I was born again because I hit the floor and I, went down a sinner and got up a saint. My life's never been the same. My life, the way I even saw the world, literally changed. And my story's probably just like anybody else's, really, at the end of the day. I don't think anything is special about my story. In fact, every time I hear a real born-again experience, it witnesses in my spirit. I'm like, yeah, exactly, right? It kind of makes me think, okay, I'm not the only one. And I've heard it hundreds of times. And that should challenge you if you don't have a story like that. If you don't have a time period. I'll be generous here and I'll say, okay, maybe you could point to a period of time in your life and a season maybe where that, maybe it was a slow death and then, a slow rebirth. Maybe. Okay, but there should be a point in time that you point to and you can say everything changed then. I have a before Christ life and I have an after Christ life, or in Christ life, I guess would be more appropriate. But yeah, I grew up in church, right? I was, I went to church once, twice a week, sometimes. We went religiously. Seriously, we didn't miss a church on a Sunday meeting, and we always showed up to church, put on our best exterior presentation. We did the best we could, and and I thank my parents for that. I'm grateful that they My mom, at least. I can't say that for my father. Now, he did have a conversion experience later in life after I was in my teens and early 20s. He didn't go to church his whole life. I mean, he was growing up, my father was laying in bed on Sunday. He worked from home and he worked all the time. Not here to put a harsh judgment on the man, but he was no church goer. He did not see the importance of church attendance. Angle that a little bit. And so, growing up, I went to church. My sister and I are both adopted. I mean, I don't know. Maybe she doesn't want the whole world to know that, but I don't. Is the facts. It's not a secret. You can find that out. So growing up, I always felt alienated. I mean, I really did. I felt on the outside of something. I'd see how my friends and their parents bonded and interacted, and I felt like I could get so far, but I didn't quite have that. I felt like an orphan. I mean, a lot of times, to make matters worse, my mom had expressed on a couple of occasions that, I wish I'd never adopted you and things like that. And that hurt. It cut pretty deep, and having kids now myself, and I try to be very cognizant, very conscious, very aware that everything I say matters. There's power in words. Everything I say to my son and my daughter, like, I may not even think they're going to remember it, but they're a sponge. They soak it up, and so I had some of that. Now, I mean, I can also say I don't hold any hard feelings against, like my mom or anything like that, because she was doing the best she could given the circumstances of her parents, who were emotionally and verbally and physically abusive to her. So, what small scrapes and emotional bruises I may have picked up along the way, I can't really say that's my mom's fault. You know what I mean? The Lord has healed those wounds. But nonetheless, growing up, I felt on the outside. I felt alienated. I felt like, I didn't belong. And probably was on my path to being a really good kid, honestly. And then I had a personal tragedy happen in my life when I was 13. I accidentally discharged a firearm and killed a family member. And that was, I think about it a lot. I do. I can think about it today without darkness and misery setting in. But it was the worst thing, I'd say between that and then having, I remember the first miscarriage my wife and I had. Those two things, the darkest depths. I'd say the miscarriage coming a close second to that, which sort of establishes to me, like, how dare anybody say that's not a child, that's not a person, that's not a human. When that baby died, a part of me died with that baby. The second time we did have a miscarriage, and I said, the devil is not stealing my joy this time. And so we just said no. And we pressed on, and actually I felt nothing the second time, not because I'm cold-hearted, but I felt like the enemy really tried to get me with that miscarriage. But anyway, when I was 13, this event, it happened. Young people, unsupervised, firearms in the mix, unsafe handling of firearms, lack of adult supervision, carelessness, on my part, and it happened. And that's reality. And some people, I don't know, you can think about me, I guess, whatever you want to think about me. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, it's just what it is. I was charged, with an involuntary manslaughter charge at 13. I remember having to sit in this office with a judge and to recount my story verbally to the judge or the prosecutor or whatever, as they wrote down the testimony of what happened, sitting there with my father and watching those words come out of my mouth and just utterly destroy my dad. I think that was probably one of the hardest parts of that ordeal. I mean, but I have a really good father, adopted father actually, but a very good dad. And he stayed right there by my side, and he held my hand through the whole thing. And I'm very grateful for that. But I remember sitting at the funeral, and it was not a place at all I wanted to be. I mean, and I prayed a lot through that. I ended up even going to church camp right after that. They were full, but they found a way to get me in there, and they thought this would kind of help fix things, and it didn't. I didn't need a church community. I needed a real encounter with God, and I thought maybe I had one at church camp, but I always had one at church camp. I mean, you can't really, doing the best they could to handle this situation. And I remember sitting at the funeral, and I was like, there was hundreds of people there. This family member of mine was young, a minor as well. But people loved him, and I knew that. I mean, and I always felt like kind of a loser, an outcast, but I looked up to him. He was like a best friend. He was like so, awesome, so great. And, really I think would have had just such an amazing future. And it was a tragic loss, a life cut short. And I just decided, sitting in that funeral that day, that I was going to bear the weight of this, that I was going to take this, and it was going to be my cross to bear. And I remember praying a prayer, and I said, God, I will never forgive myself. I deserve to be miserable for this. I deserve to suffer. I don't deserve any good thing. And I made a vow, I'm sure God wasn't listening, but you better believe the devil was. And he heard that prayer, and he pushed me to put my money where my mouth was, because I spiraled from 13, 14, 15. I'm starting to experiment with drugs. I discover punk rock. I started playing guitar when I was 13 to heal, and I remember, oh God, my grandfather, who would have been the same grandfather to this family member, and I remember him just weeping, and I'd never seen that man cry, and he gave me a guitar. And I remember him opening up, sharing with me that he had actually accidentally run somebody over and killed them. And I didn't know that. And I just remember him weeping and just being so broken. So, and again, me sitting there, and I'm like, thanks for the guitar. And just thinking like, yet another reason why I need to not forgive myself. I need to carry this burden, this weight. But I got a guitar, and I started playing music, started playing punk rock, and I loved it, man. I mean, let me tell you, it was like there was a kind of music that represented how I felt, and it was just like F you to the world. And that was me. It was like, I don't care what anyone says. The truth was I did. And I began to use drugs. And, I remember smoking marijuana on the side of my house when I was just, 15 years old, going in the garage, and I would get high, and I'd come inside, and just my mind would just be blown, and watching TV, and then it became more than just a casual thing. I started getting high with my friends, and then By the time I was 17, I smoked marijuana all day long, every day. I drank every other day. And on the weekends, but when I was just 16, we'd go partying on Thursday. I'd go to school Thursday morning. I'd disappear, skip school Friday, not come home, stay the night somewhere. Saturday night, Sunday night, I'd come home and then get up and go to school Monday morning. I did that all through my senior year. But I was always like, you know what? I'm a good kid. I'm a Christian. I'm a good person. And, sure, I smoke and I drink and I smoke pot, but I was like, I'll never do hard drugs. No, I'm not that kind of person. And I prided myself that I didn't do hard drugs. I prided myself that I was still a virgin in high school, and I thought, I'm going to save myself till marriage. Well, guess what? I ended up on hard drugs, and I didn't save myself till marriage, and that was all just part of the unraveling of it all, thinking that I'm a good person, thinking that like somehow I'm good enough, but I wasn't. And then I remember it was like my senior year, last day of school was the first time I ever took LSD. And then, and I thought, okay, well, this is the big one. Here we go. So now we're down this slippery slope. But let me tell you, like, for me personally, from my experience of using drugs, I loved it. The very first time I ever got high, I thought, this is what I've been looking for. This is the answer. I don't want to ever be sober. This makes me who I am. This fulfills my destiny. I had confidence. I wasn't depressed, except when the drugs would run out. Or I'd come down, I'd be even darker and lower than I was before I used. But I just would stay high all day long. Then I move out, I graduate high school. I'm supposed to go to college, show up the first day for like 5 minutes and just totally blow it off, space it. Said no, and I don't even drop my classes, and I end up with like a full 4 Fs for my very first term in college. I had inherited, or I had a trust fund to go to college on. It was like $6,000 or $7,000. Move out of my parents' house, move into an apartment with a couple of buddies, and it was just 24/7 party. And I blew that $7,000 on cocaine, and alcohol and marijuana in like a month. And looking back then I thought like, man, how are you gonna spend that much money, that fast? But I did, and we just lived it up. Started hanging out with all kinds of people, got introduced to ecstasy, started going to raves, and I was probably about 19, 20 at that point. I just began to take MDMA like crazy. I've taken X hundreds of times. Not to mention, all the while, I'm drinking and doing drugs and driving under the influence daily. And I ate hundreds of tabs of ecstasy. We would smoke meth and stay up for days, and then I can kind of remember the start of things, when I was like 20, 21. I can drink legally. I'm going to the bar, getting wasted, driving home at 2 a.m. every night. Just drugs, drinking every day. Between the time I'm 21, 25, I could just tell you, but I used every day something, somehow, some way, between the time I was 18, 17 to 25, and there I was, just doing drugs. But the meth and the opiates, I felt like I could control a lot of that other stuff. I did a lot of cocaine. We'd snort lines this long that were, but I didn't really like it. I did it all the time, but I hated it. I thought, this is just a nasty drug, and I just hated it. I don't like the way it makes me feel, and it just seems like it ain't worth the money. But then the first time I smoked meth, and it was like instant, like I was who I was meant to be. I was funny, I was alive, I was confident, I was, smart, I could think, I could talk, I could, all these things I thought that I was getting from this drug. And you don't, really good meth, like you don't even really think you don't feel high, you just feel better than you feel like you're 100 feet tall and bulletproof, and you just go. And I would go for days, man. I would just burn, no sleep for days. Now I realized that didn't really feel good when you came down, when you ran out of meth. And I realized that if I stayed up but I balanced it with opiates, that I could just take these pain pills, OxyContin or, hydrocodone. I was eating 10, hydrocodone at a time. Sometimes the extra strength ones, the 7.5 milligrams. I would eat 10 of those, chew them up, and I'd just go for days, high on meth, high on, pain pills. And then, all I could say is somewhere along the way, a guy that I bought pills from, who actually ended up going to prison for said distribution at some point. One day I saw a Bible in his car, and I was like, let me also preface this, like in that dark time, I realized that God was pursuing me, and I told God, I said, look, I know you're king, I know you're God, I know that you are exactly who the Word of God says you are. I know Jesus is it. It's not Muhammad, it's not Allah, it's not, Buddha, Shiva, or Vishnu. It's Jesus. And I want nothing to do with it. And I honor that you are God, but I do not want to live for you. I do not want to serve you. I want you to go away. Leave me alone. And God did. And that's why I was surprised when I saw the Bible. And I was like, it's cynical. I wasn't an atheist, but I was like, a Bible, come on, what? And then I talked to my friend. I was like, why do you have a Bible in your car? Well, I go to this church. And I thought, I don't know, man. You go to church, like you sell drugs. Like, do you see the hypocrisy here? But he was like, you know what? I make time and I go and I praise God. And I thought, well, that's weird, but okay. And he said, you should come. And I thought, I'm done with that church thing, I'm not really in for all that. But then I was like, one time I was like, okay, you know what? Let's go to this church. And he said, you're going to like it there. The music's loud. People got tattoos and stuff. I didn't have any tattoos, but the music was loud, and I liked punk rock. So we went. And I remember walking into this church, just spun out at the lowest point of my drug life. And I walked into the room, and I was like, I felt the presence of God. I don't know any other way to say it. I didn't know that you could feel that in a church. And I was just like undone by the fact that I knew God was there. And I was so just crazy blown away by this. And I was like, God is here. And so we went back. We went back. Didn't stop using drugs. We'd stay up all night. And then I got to one of the lowest points in my life. And I remember there I was. I'd lost my job. I was living in my parents' house. At one point I was living in an abandoned house that had no running water, no heat. And I ended up moving back to my parents' house. I was unemployed, no job, no friends. And my mom comes in on March 16th, 2005, when I'm sitting on the edge of the bed, strung out. And she said, I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need help. And I was like, okay. My first thought was, I'm going to run away. I have a friend in Arizona. I was like, can I just have your gas card? I'll go fill up my tank and I'll drive away and I'll leave your life forever. You don't ever have to think about me again. She didn't like the idea. She said, no, let's get you into a treatment program and I'll pay for it. I was like, okay. So the next day, March 17th, was the first clean and sober day of my life. And I went, and I'm actually going to stop this here. And and I'm going to make this into 2 parts because it's a little longer than I thought it had been. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it here because I do have some work to do. So that means you'll have to get the 5 minutes of the gospel in part 2. So I encourage you, if you got this far, you might as well stick around until I can post the second part of my testimony. Remember, you overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the power of your testimony. I'm not trying to glorify the life I lived, but I want to paint a picture to you of where I was to where I am today, because God can do it. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you've been or how low the dark places have been in your life. God can turn it around. So don't miss the good news. The good part comes in the second part. Okay. Thanks for listening.